Dámy a páni, v tejto chvíli je čas na naše prvé plenárne zasadnutie, ktoré bude na tému trendy pozorované Radou Európy v oblasti násilia páchaného na ženách a domáceho násilia v Európe. A ja len teda pripomeniem, že do týchto diskusí a do týchto prednášok sa budete môcť aj vy zapájať, a to prostredníctvom slajda. Môžeme si teoreticky ukázať QR kód, ktorý si viete naskenovať, alebo sa manuálne pripojiť cez tento hashtag a číselný kód priamo do miestnosti, kde budete môcť pokladať otázky, ktoré ja potom budem tlmočiť alebo pýtať sa ďalej vo vašom mene našich vzácnych hostí. Takto bude fungovať slajdo. Samozrejme, druhou možnosťou je, že tento mikrofón, ktorý v tejto chvíli držím vo svojich rukách, dáme vám na kolovanie a budete sa môcť pýtať aj priamo osobne našich vzácnych hostí a hostiek na témy alebo na otázky, ktoré vás zaujímajú na doplnenie, ak by teda niečo ešte nezaznelo, čo by ste chceli, aby zaznelo. Verím, že tieto technické veci sme si vyjasnili celkom jasne, preto si v tejto chvíli dovolím pozvať sem na toto miesto dámu, ktorá preberie žezlo nad prvým zasadnutím. Ešte raz, dámy a páni, témou prvého plenárneho zasadnutia sú trendy pozorované Radou Európy v oblasti násilia páchaného na ženách a domáceho násilia v Európe, a dámou, ktorá bude viesť toto plenárne zasadnutie, je Marta Becerra, vedúca spolupráce v oblasti rodovej rovnosti na odboru rodovej rovnosti. Ladies and gentlemen, Marta Becerra.
Hello. Yes, this is the... Hello, good morning. I will be speaking in English, unfortunately. My Slovak is not very good. Thank you very much for the invitation today, to the Slovak authorities for their hospitality in this beautiful building. Dear Ambassador and dear Norway Grants partners, it is my absolute honor to be here with you today, sharing what the Council of Europe is seeing as trends in support services for victims of violence against women and domestic violence. And it's also excellent that NGO representatives are here with us today, and I encourage you to pose questions and to be critical if necessary. I think your role is absolutely key in order to stop violence against women and domestic violence. So I wanted to share with you that the last time I was in Slovakia was 5 years ago. And since then, I've had 2 children, and also bad things have happened in the world, as you're very much aware. There's been war, there's been a pandemic, but there's also been good things happening. Last year, we had several ratifications of the Council of Europe Istanbul Convention, Ukraine among them in the midst of war, but also the Republic of Moldova, UK, and very recently, the European Union. Only 3-4 days ago, Latvia also joined the family of the Council of Europe. So I think there's positive developments and trends that we need to acknowledge, although as my boss, Katerina Volonyesa, was saying, there are still challenges, and I look forward to our discussions today to see what we can do together in the future. So the Istanbul Convention in 2024 will mark its 10th year anniversary since its entry into force. What we are seeing in these 10 years is that the Istanbul Convention is a landmark treaty that is pushing for reform and for getting everyone together to combat violence against women. First and foremost, it's setting very strong legal obligations to member states to have support services available for all victims to all forms of violence against women. It is driving change in the national response to the victims of domestic violence. It is pushing the creation or the improvement of the accessibility of services, such as helplines or shelters, where they did not exist in the past, or that they are expanded through the requirements of the Istanbul Convention. This increase of services has led to more reporting to women and more awareness of this phenomenon. It's also guiding governments in addressing gaps that are existing. The most common of them are the shortcomings in the number, in the scope, in the geographical distribution of such services, but also, and very importantly, in the funding of those organizations that provide these services, women organizations and NGOs, and I'm sure that you know all this too well. There's the existence of physical communication, cultural or administrative barriers to access protection and support and justice, especially for women that are victims of multiple discrimination, such as ethnic minorities, Roma women, women with disabilities, trans women. It is also one of the most common gaps, the lack of systemic training of all professionals. Training exists. Many countries, if not all, provide some training for professionals, but due to turnout of professionals or moving around of different services, this training tends not to be sustainable, and also it tends to focus very much on certain aspects of violence. It's not comprehensive, or sometimes it's not gender informed. Last but not least, the Istanbul Convention after 10 years is serving as a platform for exchanges between peers on what is working and what is not working. So for me, and focusing more on the Istanbul Convention requirements, it's very important to highlight the principles that you are seeing on your screen. These are the, let's say, overarching values on how support services need to be provided to women victims of violence. It has to be done in cooperation of all the relevant agencies. It has to involve NGOs. It has to have a gender perspective, be centered on the needs of the victims, be focused in providing empowerment and autonomy to women, and provide information that is needed for women to make informed decisions. So how does these general overarching principles work together? And I will be going through also the trends that we are seeing through our monitoring of Grevio, but also the Council of Europe cooperation activities. The involvement of all agencies, we are seeing that most states have some certain sort of cooperation among agencies, but most models focus almost exclusively on domestic violence or intimate partner violence. Sometimes, even when they exist, the shortcomings are addressed at the more practical level on how the different mandates of different agencies and the NGOs come together. I think multi-agency cooperation is one of the first things that ratified states tend to focus on. We are seeing this in Moldova, where we cooperate following ratification. That is very recent. And this is the first thing that states tend to work on, how to cooperate among each other. Involvement of NGOs, and I'm sure you can agree with me, it's absolutely key. And this is systematically encouraged by Grevio, even when there's no particular shortcoming in the country. They always stress the need for having women organizations and NGOs involved meaningfully. Let's look now at the center of all Istanbul Convention requirements, the victim. A gender perspective in the design and implementation of policies is one of the requirements, even when, however, in the challenges that we are seeing through monitoring, is that sometimes, even when these policies are gender informed in their design, they are not necessarily gender informed in their implementation. And this brings me back to the issue of training and the systematic approach to training. We are seeing in some countries some tendency to reformulate policies on gender equality as family policies or motherhood policies, and to prioritize the protection of the family over the discrimination of women. Some countries approach these gender-informed policies with a focus on family mediation and reconciliation, or an approach that is gender neutral, talking about clients instead of a victim and a perpetrator. Again, how important it is that the training is systematic and it is gender informed. The second element is to avoid secondary victimization and to set up one-stop shops. Grevio has highlighted some disempowering practices into dealing with victims, asking them to be cooperative or to accommodate to the perpetrator's behavior, or to suggest reconciliation when violence happens. One way to counter secondary victimization is setting one-stop shops. And this is done in several countries. But this is not done extensively. Even in one country that this might be set up, it's only done in part of a municipality, and it's not widespread all throughout the territory. There is an example of what the country in particular call family justice centers, which is in theory a good practice. However, again, in the practice, this basically is focused on child abuse instead of focusing on the needs of women victims, and lacking the recognition of the gender dimension of domestic violence. Sometimes access to services is dependent on the victim pressing charges, which is going against the convention, and an obligation to report to professionals is another of the shortcomings. Reporting by professionals, it's fine. It is not against the convention. Blanket obligations to report can lead to women actually not accessing support because of the fear or the distrust in the system. So we have to be very nuanced in how we approach the obligation to report by professionals, health professionals in particular, and to respect the empowerment and autonomy of women. Information about available services is also a requirement of the convention, and as I'm sure you're already well aware, the nuance here is that information needs to be made in a format that is accessible to all women. And this is sometimes requires access in different languages, minority languages, but also we live in a world that is, spread the use of internet, but sometimes some communities, some women will not have so easy access, so this needs to be taken into consideration when information is disseminated. Grevio has noted an example of a country where the information was disseminated in 8-9 languages, so it can be also accessible for women migrants or asylum-seeking women. As you know, there's a certain categorization of the Istanbul Convention in the types of services that the victims need to access. And I will be dealing with parts of these services because the protection pillar, as we call it, of the convention is quite large. And I will be focusing today, in keeping with the topic of the conference, in support services, specialist and general, and in violence support services. So the Istanbul Convention distinguishes between general services, which are available to all of the population and to which women victims of violence also need to have access to, and these are typically social services, employment, health, and also specialist services, which are the one catered to the needs of women. I remind you that the principles that we saw at the beginning apply into how we provide these types of services. So what are the promising practices that we are seeing from the Council of Europe, and what are the challenges? In general services, one of the problems, the key sectors that is problematic is housing and employment. Even though in countries where this is a requirement by law that victims of domestic violence or violence against women are given priority, the lack of housing availability is problematic. Training, and I'm sorry I have to repeat this because it's very important, it exists, but there is shortcomings on how training is fulfilled. There's good practices in especially the health sector on how to identify and give referral for victims of sexual violence, especially for those communities such as Roma that might be at a more vulnerable situation. So training to these professionals is positive. In the challenges, we see uneven access and differences in resources available, especially in those countries that have a federal configuration, and there's an uneven, there's difference between the different provinces or region. Access for vulnerable women is also one of the key challenges, especially Roma and ethnic minorities. Insufficient funding, especially for women organizations and NGOs, and with insufficient, I also mean sustainable, and access to health care, especially for victims of sexual violence. In terms of specialist services, There is, following ratification, a tendency to expand services, to create them where they do not existed in the past. And there is a tendency, as I say, to focus on domestic violence. So some countries are mapping what is available for other forms of violence against women, and this is really welcome. Again, the challenge is the focus on domestic violence, limitations in the provision of support by state institutions, and I must emphasize the Istanbul Convention does not require either way, either state institutions to provide support or NGOs to provide support. But it does recognize the expertise that NGOs have as long-standing organizations providing support and in need of recognition of their role. Sometimes also by focusing only on provision of services by the state, victims tend not to report. So there has to be, each country is different, and it needs to be ensuring a balance so that they recognize the important role of NGOs while at the same time, if so desired, the provision of services can be done by the state. The assistance provided for a specific group of victims continues to be, as I say, and I know I'm repeating, but it is key also the need to take into account the needs of specific groups of women that are in a vulnerable situation. Moving on to the last part on support services for sexual violence, as you know very well, the requirement is to provide both short-term and long-term support for victims, ranging from medical care, but also to trauma support, psychological support, by the setting up of rape crisis centers or sexual referral centers. This is one of the areas that I think most countries are struggling with on how to provide services for victims of sexual violence. There is an increase in number, but by no way is sufficient enough. And as you see in the slide, except for Denmark, there's no country, member state of the Istanbul Convention, that meets the requirement of one center per 200,000 inhabitants. Training of professionals, especially of the health sector, is still lacking in a systematic way. There is a lack of protocols or guidelines on how to address sexual violence. Sometimes there is a requirement for the victim to file a complaint in order to receive the support, and whereas most countries focus on short-term sexual violence support, they lack long-term support for victims. So I'm hoping, I'm not painting a very dim picture, but I think you have a lot of work ahead. I think that violence against women is not unstoppable. It is stoppable, but I think what is unstoppable is your work and your determination to provide the support that victims need. So I'm very happy that you're here today, and I'm looking forward to the discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Becerra, maybe don't leave because now is the time for discussion. Yeah, maybe this is the right time for everybody to use Slido. Ja teraz prepnem do slovenčiny. Teraz je možno najvyšší čas použiť Slido. Ja už som teraz spomínal, že stačí, keď si naskenujete tento QR kód, ale ak ste príliš ďaleko, nejde ho naskenovať, dá sa aj ručne na stránke www.slido.com vložiť tento kód. Ten vás automaticky presmeruje do miestnosti, kde momentálne sú zatiaľ dve otázky. Tá prvá je moja, funguje Slido, ale tu preskočíme. Ale máme tam, we have a question for you. Don't worry, I can do it in English. I'm just explaining how Slido works. So till then we got one question for you in Slido. Ak by sa vám Slido nerozbehlo, tak samozrejme dám aj mikrofón kolovať, ktorý môžete použiť tiež na kladenie otázok. The first question is, does the Council of Europe identify a need to rebrand the term intimate partner violence? Partners don't act violently, perhaps something like intimate relationship violence or other.
I didn't get the last part. Rename it?
Yeah, rebrand it. The example was perhaps something like intimate relationships violence or something like this.
I haven't heard of any discussion about rebranding it. I think what is important is that in the way that we provide the support, it's very clear that the partners are not in an equal relation. And this is one of the problematic issues, I think, in some countries, that they would see problems in intimate partner relation as in an equal standing. And this is why in some countries they are called clients, for example. So to me, it's not a question of rebranding so much. It's a question of how we address the violence itself. And we see that there is a perpetrator and there is a victim, and that the provision of services acts accordingly. For example, conciliation is a tendency in some countries where you get the perpetrator and the victim together. And this can be very disempowering, because if there is a situation of control, you are not in the same standing as the perpetrator. So by putting them together, you're actually not helping the victim. So these type of situations, to me, as long as it's clear how the dynamics of violence work, the rebranding is not necessarily needed.
Pevne verím, že ste všetci porozumeli, konec koncov máme aj simultánny preklad. Na túto odpoveď stále čakáme ďalšie otázky, tie zatiaľ nie sú, takže pokiaľ by sa niekto chcel prihlásiť a položiť otázku priamo cez mikrofón, je tá možnosť. Okay, we got a first question here. Maybe I can use my microphone. There you go.
Ja by som sa
translate? Yes.
Ja by som sa chcela opýtať vlastne na deti, lebo teda deti sú častokrát akože prítomné v situáciách násilia a Istanbulský dohovor má aj vlastne články, ktoré sa týkajú detí, ale práve na Slovensku, práve v súvislosti vlastne s rodičovskými právami a so zverovaním detí, stykom, a bohužiaľ máme momentálne veľmi rozšírenú prax, kde sa deje práve to, že jednak sa neberie do úvahy násilie, keď súdy rozhodujú. A druhá vec je, že máme vlastne taký rozkol, že na jednej strane máme ochranné opatrenia na zákaz vstupu, zákaz priblíženia. Na druhej strane vlastne momentálne máme prístup, kde pokiaľ teda ide o deti, tak ženy sú nútené sa učiť komunikovať s násilníkom a častokrát deti sú nútené chodiť na styk k otcovi, z ktorého majú strach. Tak ma len zaujíma, že keď ste vypracovávali vlastne správy v rámci grévia, že či toto je niečo, čo vnímate ako závažný problém aj tak celkovo.
Ďakujem pekne. Thank you for your question.
Thank you very much. Yes, you're absolutely right. One of the requirements of the convention is that custody and visitation rights are take into account a history of domestic violence. So by all means, yes. And we see in some countries, and Grevio has monitored some countries where civil, especially those where the civil part is delinked from the criminal case, they don't take into consideration one another, and there's cases where the custody arrangements force the children and the victim to be again in face-to-face with the perpetrator. So yes, there is a requirement of the convention, and Grevio emphasized this more and more. We are working as well with our colleagues in the children's division to come up with some guidelines on guardianship and custody rights in cases of domestic violence, being one of the requirements to enhance the application of the principle of the best interests of the child. So there is, of course, a realization that this happens. There is in some countries now a labeling of this type of violence where the children are even killed by the perpetrator as a way to revenge against the mother, and they are recognizing this violence as a gender-based violence as well. And the country where I'm from, this is now one of the key issues, and they are calling this violence against the children as a form of gender-based violence and addressing it as such. But yes, you're absolutely right. This is something that it's highlighted by Grevio, and we see as well in our cooperation with member states. Yeah.
Thank you for your answer. We got a few more questions in Slido.
Sure.
The one is about the ratification of Istanbul Convention. This ratification was a big political topic even in our country. I'm brave to say that it was misused a lot.
Yeah.
And the question is, what can be done to improve the state of ratification of Istanbul Convention in Central and Eastern Europe?
Okay. Yes, it has been misused. I think the Istanbul Convention has been hijacked by some far-right religious family tradition groups, and they are mispresenting it as something that it's not. So I think one way to do it is to have you, NGOs and other authorities, disseminate proper information about the Istanbul Convention and what it means. This is the first step, I think. We are trying to support NGOs to campaign in favor of the convention and to disseminate proper information. And we have done so in all of the countries that have not ratified the Istanbul Convention in the EU. Unfortunately for Slovakia, we didn't receive any applications. So I'm looking forward to the discussions with you. I'm not accusing, I want to understand, because I think you are absolutely instrumental to disseminate proper information about the Istanbul Convention among decision makers in particular, because it has been misconstrued as a convention. I've heard all sorts of stories about Grevio stealing babies from families, or promoting third sex in some countries. So there's a lot of wild stories about the Istanbul Convention, and I think we are in a position of a good position to disseminate proper information about the Istanbul Convention and therefore foster decision makers to ratify.
Yeah, hopefully this works, because in our country, we had elections and a lot of topics were misused and, as you said, hijacked. And one of them was also NGOs, because you can see still big billboards in Slovakia who say stop NGOs. So this is the situation in our country right now. So maybe some support from European Council would be very nice, because we all know that NGOs are doing a lot of hard work.
I know.
So the next question is, I see a big focus on trainings. Is there any European program supporting systematical trainings for healthcare workers and institutions in European countries?
For health, as Council of Europe, we very much focus on law enforcement as the first responder and legal professionals because of the need to understand the convention. And we have a wide range of trainings, especially online, such as the European Program for Human Rights Education for Legal Professionals, HELP, and we have several courses on violence against women, but these are targeting this type of professionals. In some of our cooperation with our member states, we are starting to focus very much on health workers, because we are seeing that there is a gap there. So thank you for the question. I think it's key to address health workers, and we are starting little by little to work on that as well.
Thank you very much. These are pretty much all the questions from Slido, so maybe we can use the microphone. Máme otázku, nech sa páči.
Okay, can you hear me? I am Solveig Bergman for the Norwegian Center for Violence and Traumatic Stress Studies. I have one comment and one question. My comment deals with politics of naming, what we call a social phenomenon. And I think because Council of Europe is very broad, many member countries with different historical, etc., cultural traditions. And I think that we also have to be pragmatic and tolerant to various politics of naming. For example, in Norway, we certainly in Norway have a very broad understanding of the gendered structure of domestic violence. Women are the ones who are most seriously affected, and so on. We are very aware of that. Still, many of us prefer to use the concept of violence in close relations. Firstly, in order to include children. I think that's very important. And secondly, also to be aware of that we do have male victims of domestic violence. Not in numbers so many, but numbers, I mean, everybody who is a victim of domestic violence is one too many. So, but this does not mean that we would have a gender-neutral approach as such. We do see the power structure also in gender relations. So that was just one comment. I think we have to accept a kind of broad approach to politics of naming a phenomenon. Then my second issue is a concrete question. What about perpetrators and the Istanbul Convention? I mean, I know that perpetrators are mentioned, but can you perhaps elaborate a little bit more? How should we reach? How should we assist? How should we help? How should we prevent perpetrators from, repeating the act? And also, many perpetrators have been also themselves victims of violence, for example, in the childhood. Do you support or encourage special programs for perpetrators? Can you elaborate a little bit on this? Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for your question.
Yeah. If you don't mind, to your comment on the broad terms, to me, and I think it's what the Istanbul Convention frames domestic violence in particular, it's not the same close relation violence that gender-based violence. The recognition of the Istanbul Convention is that domestic violence in particular is gender-based, which is not necessarily the case, for example, of intergenerational violence or violence against children. This does not mean that there is a gender element to violence against children sometimes, but the recognition that domestic violence affects way more women than men needs to be set up into the setting of any country. We are seeing in certain Nordic countries that the tendency is to reverse to gender-neutral approaches. So if you're telling me in Norway we are very clear that there is a power structure, that there is an understanding of gender considerations of violence, then fantastic. But in some Nordic countries we are perceiving that there is a reverse into gender-neutral approaches, which in order to, if we see the Istanbul Convention, this is not the way it should be implemented. Regarding perpetrator, yes, the Istanbul Convention covers perpetrators as well under the prevention pillar, as you say, as a way to prevent further violence. It's Article 16. I didn't cover it today because there's many, the Istanbul Convention is quite broad, so I thought to focus more on support services for victims. But there is requirements on how this provision of services of rehabilitation or treatment programs for domestic violence perpetrator and sex offenders need to be set up. In some of our cooperation programs, we are setting up perpetrator programs in countries where they did not exist before, and we are training professionals on how to provide these type of services. There is, of course, the European network on working with perpetrators, and they have done fantastic work in gathering best practices from Europe and beyond on how to provide these programs for perpetrators.
Thank you, Marta. I see we got another question here. There you go.
Thank you. Marta, thank you for an excellent overview of the state of art. I have a question, or actually a comment. It's so tempting to comment on that with health, because World Health Organization is one of the participating organizations also in this conference. And they do an excellent work, and they have been working a lot with the gender-based and domestic violence too. So I think collaboration would be a very nice thing, even more than you probably already do. As in mental health area, there are a very strong kind of collaborational structures in place already. So it would be very nice to see something like that also in this area. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comment. We actually do have 3 more questions on Slido, so if I can go back to Slido.
I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing that I'm receiving so many questions.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic, so people do have questions. So,
Sure.
This one is about personal information. How to resolve the problem of protection of data of the victim in order to provide protection and assistance, legal and psychological, to her by relevant entities. So how to protect data?
How to? I'm not a data protection expert. The requirements of the convention is, for example, in the provision of services, that the data of women, especially the data that can be accessed by the perpetrator, is protected. We have worked with some organizations that provide shelters, for example, to set up a way in which their data processing is confidential. and also to preserve the location of certain services for victims to make them not accessible to the perpetrator. So it's also a requirement of the convention to work on that area. I cannot know for every single country how their data should be stored, but it has to be ensured that it is confidential, and especially that the perpetrators do not have access to it.
Do you think it's a matter of training or just they do not have the, because as you said before, like some of the solutions of people working in this area is like that the victim has to meet the predator, and probably that's not right thing to do, but still it happens. So you think it's a matter of training or lack of information?
It can be, normally it's a combination of things. So training, it's one of the things. Having guidelines on exactly how the service to the victim is provided is another one. I think within the NGO and women organizations, there is a clear understanding about the need to protect the victim from the perpetrator. Because actually the reporting of violence is one of the increased risk factors for further violence. So I think this is an important element to be taken into consideration, ensuring the confidentiality of the victim. So thank you very much for the question. I think it's on point.
Yeah. So if we do have any more questions here? I think not. So thank you very much. I think these are pretty much all the questions even for Slido. So thank you very much. Ešte raz, dámy a páni, jeden veľký potlesk pre Martu Becerra, vedúcu spolupráce v oblasti rodovej rovnosti na odbore rodovej rovnosti